lovely, eccentrically organized panel. Our four panelists come from very different perspectives and have some very interesting material to share with us. We're going to begin, the way I'd like to organize the panelists, just have each presenter speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then at the end of the panel ask for questions or comments and hopefully have a good discussion. And our first presenter is Terry Beers. I asked each panelist to send me some biographical information, and Terry is an associate professor of English at Santa Clara University, where he teaches expository writing courses and American literature courses. He's the general editor of a new series of books co-published by Santa Clara University and Heyday Books called California Legacy, which is, its purpose is to bring out new anthologies, single author works, and reprints of out-of-print classical works of California literature and history. And as part of that series, a new anthology will be published in October called Unfolding Beauty, Celebrating the California Landscape. I asked each presenter to also disclose their affiliation with some unorthodox community, and I think Terry wins the prize. He said, "I'm an associate member of the Sierra Nevada Dog Drivers, which is a club for professional and recreational dog mushers centered in California, and a volunteer for the Bureau of Land Management's land renovation project at Fort Ord, where, among other things, we work on eradicating noxious, non-native weeds and replanting native vegetation in that coastal community." Terry Beers.
Jackie, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to begin by begging the question. I've been asked to talk about how California writers might map the natural and human geography of California. I'm mostly interested in landscape writers, and I can't imagine any real consensus coming from that group here. So what I'd like to do is to sort of ask the question in a different way, because to me it's led me to consider two competing motifs in what I see as California landscape writing. And by that I mean writing that takes landscape as theme, not just as setting. Okay? And one motif might loosely be called the humanist motif, and that's where landscape is often seen as benign, where that particular motif sees human progress as celebratory. It sees human beings as beneficiaries of nature. I think back to De Anza standing at the Carmel River, for example, and in his diary talking about the size of the salmon and how wonderful that's going to be. And you can just see the seeds of progress coming from that one observation. We see it in early travel writing. We see it in California booster books, you know, the books that were written to bring people to California to talk about how wonderful the California landscape is. We see it in memoirs, and it's embedded in a good deal of California muckraking. You know, books like Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona, for example. Now, another motif is what is sometimes called the inhumanist motif, and that is a word that comes from the California poet Robinson Jeffers. And in this particular point of view, it sort of refuses to see human beings as anything apart from nature and natural processes. It often as not celebrates the destructive as well as the procreative or creative processes of nature. And my own sense is that this is the stronger dominant motif in California landscape writing, much more interesting in many ways. The inhumanist writers tend to be highly individualistic. They are often suspicious of large communities, however unorthodox, and thus they are also subversive of political processes, and they tend to see human institutions as transitory and ultimately inconsequential. Now, these motifs don't usually emerge as pure expressions, but I wanted to illustrate them with a handful of examples this morning to give you a sense of maybe what I'm talking about and maybe why I found this topic so difficult to tackle. I want to give you a paragraph from a piece called New Almaden. This was written by Mary Halleck Foote, and if you know Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose, Sarah Ward, the character in there, is based on Mary Halleck Foote. And she comes to California. She marries the mining engineer in charge of the New Almaden mercury mines, and this is in the 1870s. And she's also a writer and an illustrator, and she wrote this particular sketch for Scribner's magazine. And I just gave you a little bit of it, but listen to the way she describes the first bit of landscape. Toward the close of the dry season, when brown and dusty August burns into browner, dustier September, a keen remembrance of all cool, watery joys takes possession of one's thoughts. The lapping of ripples in pebbly coves, the steady thump of oars in rowlocks, the smell of apple blossoms on damp spring evenings, old mill races, mossy and dripping, the bleating of frightened lambs at a sheep washing, and the hoarse, stifled complaint of their mothers mingled with the rushing of the stream. All these once common sounds and sights haunt the memory. So it's dry in California, so we're just going to go back and think about New England and talk about this sort of pastoral landscape that's much more benign and perhaps in her terms, much more nurturing, okay? Edwin Markham wrote The Man with the Hoe in 1899. This one poem netted him something like $200,000. This particular poem was talking about the sort of difficult life led by people in rural areas. But Markham never really achieved the same kind of fame and success with anything else he wrote, but he wrote a lot. And one of the books that he wrote was something called California the Wonderful. And once again, listen to this little excerpt of landscape here. This is set in Southern California. While skirting the outlands, a half hour from the heart of Los Angeles, you come upon a remarkable achievement of engineering, the Mount Lowe Railway, the first in California to lift the traveler to the clouds. Will you take a flight to the clouds, then ride out through the gardens and orchards and bloom-bright towns and brilliant poppy banks and mount the cable car at Rubio Canyon above Pasadena and sweep skyward? Up there, standing on the Triple Crown summit, you are looking out on the blue of the Pacific that is melting into the blue of the sky. Santa Monica, Venice, Redondo, Long Beach, with their bathers and fishermen, are a flight of shore towns fading down toward the south. Further out in the luminous sea lies Santa Catalina, the top of a broad mountain peak, lifted out of the deep ocean floor. Mysterious caves are there, and dwells, and windy, mossy ways. There too is Avalon. Now listen to this. Beautiful valleys stretch below you, the San Gabriel, La Cañada, and the San Fernando, once tinted long ago with wildflowers and roved over by the buccaneer bees, but now all covered over with groves and gardens of the most highly specialized tillage in the world. You know, flowers, bees, wonderful, this is nature, but we've tilled it over, and that's just as good, if not better. And so you have this sense of loss in terms of the landscape, but as the human footprint gets pressed ever deeper, this is okay too. We're making progress, okay? Now I want to contrast that with another California writer, John Muir. Helped to found the Sierra Club, and in this particular passage, I think we get the first inklings of the true inhumanist position. This is from the Yosemite. John Muir, by the way, I think was a loon. At 2:30 of a moonlit morning in March, I was awakened by a tremendous earthquake, and though I had never enjoyed a storm of this sort, the strange thrilling motion could not be mistaken, and I ran out of my cabin both glad and frightened, shouting, "A noble earthquake, a noble earthquake," feeling sure I was going to learn something. Well, the shocks were so violent and varied and succeeded one another so closely that I had to balance myself carefully in walking as if on a deck of a ship among waves, and it seemed impossible that the high cliffs of the valley could escape being shattered. In particular, I feared that the sheer-fronted Sentinel Rock, towering above my cabin, would be shaken down, and I took shelter back of a large yellow pine, hoping that it might protect me from at least the smaller outbounding boulders. I mean, imagine this scene. He's afraid of Sentinel Rock coming down, and he's hiding behind a tree. For a minute or two, the shocks became more and more violent, flashing horizontal thrusts mixed with a few twists and battering explosive upheaving jolts, as if nature were wrecking her Yosemite temple and getting ready to build a still better one. And that's a fascinating passage. I mean, Yosemite, we look at this as being sort of a pinnacle of natural beauty. Muir sees this point where he thinks it could even be destroyed, but that doesn't bother him because it's part of this natural process, and what we get on the other side of this might be even better. And at the same time, he's not at all heedful of his own personal danger. And lest you think you won't see this in cities, here's Raymond Chandler. There was a desert wind blowing that night. It was one of those hot, dry Santa Anas that come down through the mountain passes and curl your hair and make your nerves jump and your skin itch. On nights like that, every booze party ends in a fight. Meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and study their husbands' necks. Anything can happen. You can even get a full glass of beer at a cocktail lounge. So we have earth and air. Even if you're in the city, nature just reaches in and gets you. Listen to this from Charles Bukowski, LA's gutter poet, the model for the movie Barfly, recalling a scene as a boy in Los Angeles during the Depression. This is from a poem called "We Ain't Got No Money, Honey, But We Got Rain." I particularly remember the rains of the Depression era. There wasn't any money, but there was plenty of rain. It wouldn't rain for just a night or a day. It would rain for 7 days and 7 nights, and in Los Angeles, the storm drains weren't built to carry off that much water, and the rain came down thick and mean and steady, and you heard it banging against the roofs and into the ground. Waterfalls of it came down from the roofs, and often there was hail, big rocks of ice, bombing, exploding, smashing into things, and the rain just wouldn't stop, and all the roofs leaked. Dishpans, cooking pots were placed all about. They dripped loudly and had to be emptied again and again. It doesn't matter where you are, nature is going to get you. So we have earth, air, water. What about fire? Well, here's Robinson Jeffers. Robinson Jeffers coined the term inhumanist, as I said before. He came to California from Pittsburgh as a boy. So he grew up in Southern California. When he was married, he moved to Carmel. He built a house there out of stone, lived there for the rest of his life, and became what William Everson called the archetypal Western writer. And here, I think, is a poem of his called Fire on the Hills. It kind of gives you an archetypal sense of what inhumanism is about. The deer were bounding like blown leaves under the smoke in front of the roaring wave of the brush fire. I thought of the smaller lives that were caught. Beauty is not always lovely. The fire was beautiful. The terror of the deer was beautiful. And when I returned down the black slopes after the fire had gone by, an eagle was perched on the jag of a burnt pine, insolent and gorged, cloaked in the folded storms of his shoulders. He had come from far off for the good hunting, with fire for his beater to drive the game. The sky was merciless blue, and the hills merciless black, the somber-feathered great birds sleepily merciless between them. I thought painfully, but the whole mind, the destruction that brings an eagle from heaven is better than mercy. Now that's an astounding statement. Mercy is a human quality, and he very clearly places this, lower than this sense of beauty and destruction and terror. These are natural processes. You can't map human values over these kinds of forces. Long poem that he wrote called Give Your Heart to the Hawks has a scene where a man kills his brother. He thinks the brother is in love with his wife. They want to call the police or the coroner or someone. And what the man says is, what we have done has to be borne. It's in ourselves and there's no escaping. The state of California can't help you bear it. That's only a herd of people, the state. Oh, give your heart to the hawks for a snack of meat, but not to men. And finally, one last example from Jeffers from a poem called Hurt Hawks. In this poem, a crippled hawk evokes the poet's thoughts on what he calls the wild god of the world. The wild god of the world is sometimes merciful to those that ask mercy, not often to the arrogant. You do not know him, you communal people, or you have forgotten him. Intemperate and savage, the hawk and men that are dying remember him. I'd sooner accept the penalties, kill a man than a hawk. Now, think about that. Is this the guy you want mapping California? And so I sometimes think maybe it's better to leave writers out of that equation, especially poets and naturalists, writers, novelists. They've had a lot to say to us about what's wrong with our institutions. I'm not sure that I want them telling us how to design them. What they do give us is a reminder of how important the individual perspective is against the community one, however unorthodox. And more important, they remind us, especially these inhumanist writers, of the impermanence of our institutions, howsoever we map them on the landscape. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Speaking next, my colleague from California State University, Sacramento, Angus Wright. Angus is the director of the Environmental Studies program. He is the author of a forthcoming book with an interesting title, Who Owns Nature? It follows very nicely from Terry's remarks. Property, Privilege, and Ecology in the Americas, which is going to be published by the University of Texas Press. Again, I asked Angus for some information about an unorthodox affiliation, and I learned more in an email from him than I had learned in knowing him for 10 years. What I think was most interesting about his responses, one was the information that he had lived with his family on 3 farms. His parents had 3 farms, and the names seemed very evocative to me of some of the issues that are raised by the unorthodox community idea. The first was called Suburban Heights, named ironically, he says, because it was a hopeless, miserable little piece of ground with a little shack on the outskirts of a tiny town of 212 people. The second farm was called Poverty Knob, the meaning of which is obvious. These are Angus's comments, not mine. And the third was named, which was apparently his parents' favorite, Pagan's Outpost. And what I learned from Angus is that he might define himself as a sort of pantheistic/paganistic person. I thought that was a fairly unorthodox affiliation. Angus?
Yeah, I realize, I often think that almost all Californians are pagans or pantheists. We live like it, for better and for worse. But I'm constantly reminded by surveys that 96% of people believe in God or a higher power in the traditional sense. And so being a pagan does indeed seem to be unorthodox. I think my talk follows surprisingly well from my point of view on Terry's. I was asked, I think really as the environmentalist, and I will correct you, I'm no longer the director of the Environmental Studies Center. I've gone on an early retirement to do more writing and thinking and enjoying the California landscape. I think I was asked here basically as the environmentalist to speak on behalf of bioregionalism. And what I'm going to do is really speak bioregionalism perhaps, but in an unorthodox way. In thinking about this, I was reminded of Edward Abbey, the environmental writer who, in his anger about the use of Western public lands for grazing, suggested that there should be an open season on cattle in the American West. And he said that there wouldn't be much sport in it at first, but with time the breed would improve. And I'm using that actually to suggest that even the best and most radical ideas need the assistance of evolutionary processes. And this is a kind of an argument against a fundamentalist approach to bioregionalism. Or to put it another way, I want to emphasize that bioregional political districts must recognize that the biology of California has been substantially changed by human culture, and that human culture has laid down a template of interaction between humans and nature that is as important, even for the protection of nature, as the original biological regions. And I hope I'll make that clearer as I speak. If we look a quick look at political representation in the state of California with respect to bioregions right now, might reveal a pattern roughly of what we might call upstream Republicans and downstream Democrats, which is to say roughly mountains and foothills versus the cities of the Valley and Bay, Doolittle versus Matsui, and with somewhat similar patterns in Southern California. But if we think about this historically and more analytically, we see that this is not so much based on the politics of watersheds or altitude-based floristic provinces as it's based on the politics of urban, suburban, and rural. We also, as a side note, have some historically derived anomalies in this upstream Republican, downstream Democrat phenomenon, not altogether contrary to it, but worth commenting on. What I call the irrigation Democrat, who is basically a Democrat, a conservative, who believes in massive spending on public works as the foundation for a good social order and economic growth. A particular kind of a California animal, I think. We also have things like the Republican representatives of highly urbanized areas such as Orange County, who have long maintained against all evidence to the contrary that they were living in the suburbs. The great problem of the California environment is urban sprawl. Habitat destruction, profligate use of energy, land, and other natural resources, destruction of farmland, air and non-point water pollution, nearly irreversible patterns of transportation that are not amenable to more rational solutions in the future, because of the kind of pattern of settlement that we establish that then becomes very difficult to address with less destructive transportation technologies. What could we say today in terms of the discussion today about the solution to these problems? One would be to look at bioregionalism in the classic sense, and two of the main forms of bioregionalism are watersheds and floristic provinces. And as I said, to some extent these ideas are already roughly represented by many state and federal legislative districts, with many strong exceptions. But if we look at Sacramento and the American River watershed as an example, and I think it's a fairly good one, I would maintain that a floristic province approach, or a watershed approach, would roughly duplicate the upstream Republican and downstream Democrat approach we now have. And the changes that would likely occur would actually tend to shift power to suburban conservatives, to white flight, to urban sprawl, and to massive environmental abuse, rather than towards smart growth, which would be preservation and building of community, preservation of rural land, and more intensive use of urban land, which seems to me is what we should be doing. To me, I'm going to be extremely orthodox here. I think an approach towards metropolitan regional government would do far more for California's problems and would be a genuine bioregionalism that would make far more sense than going to laying down, trying to duplicate original floristic patterns or watersheds. What we really have to face is that the fate of biological organisms in California is much more heavily determined by the city if you like, a kind of metabiological phenomenon, and urban sprawl as a kind of human eutrophication process that speeds up the processes of entropy and resource exhaustion. So the greatest biological reality from the point of view of the future of California right now is the city, and particularly the dynamic of urban sprawl generated from our self-defeating as a society patterns of urban growth, particularly urban sprawl. What we need more than a pleasing correspondence of political representation based on native vegetation and watershed patterns is control over uncontrolled urban sprawl. For that, what we need are political districts drawn in such ways as to minimize the ability of suburban voters to gain the advantages of city life while escaping taxes and the social and environmental costs of urban growth. That is the great disease that we need to address. Metropolitan regional government is one, I think by no means a sufficient, but at least a first step, which in most areas we have not been able yet to accomplish, and so I'll put that number one as the first evolutionary step towards a better breed, if you like. And that has to be done especially with special attention to ensuring that all of the taxpayers who are essentially part of the urban situation, which includes the suburbs, pay taxes that pay for the overall costs of urbanization and do not leave poor and minority communities and decaying cities at the center as an unpaid for consequence of urban sprawl. So just to be really blunt, if I were thinking about redistricting California, I would think about protecting urban core voting blocks, dispersing suburban power wherever possible, and giving genuinely rural voters the ability to protect their own interests. And I'm just throwing this out for the sake of discussion. I haven't given it all that much study, but this would reward urban Democrats, which I always think is a good idea, who, by the way, are overwhelmingly the people who vote for environmental legislation, something which very few people in the United States recognize. But if you want to find out who votes for the environment, you don't go to rural voters or suburban or rural legislators. You go to urban legislators. They are the heart of the environmental coalition. And I would punish suburban Republicans, and I would hope to probably enhance the position of, I actually don't want to do this, but I think consistent with my argument here, would enhance the position of rural Republicans overall, but it would probably make them, I hope, a bit more genuinely conservative that is protective of rural issues and rural values with respect to growth issues. So to summarize, bioregionalism properly conceived must be based on human ecology, not ecological regions considered without the history of human intervention. Bioregionalism should focus on providing protection to distinctive regional ecosystems, not on acquiring a human proxy representative for each ecosystem. And then as I was listening to Terry's presentation, I wrote a sentence here which I hope will make sense to you as a kind of larger summary that might to some extent incorporate your ideas. That Arcadian dreams tend to blind Californians to our own destructive capacities as admirers of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. I think we have a very interesting panel because we're going to get a spectrum of perspectives that move us from emphasis on nature to discussion of sort of human centers to community building. And our next speaker is James Reed Jr. Mr. Reed is a project manager for the California Energy Commission, and he has a very distinguished resume involving activities with the Congressional Black Congress Energy Brain Trust, activities involving county supervisor districts and political redistricting. I was very impressed by his service on the boards of Families First, Habitat for Humanity, the United Way, consultant to the California Department of Education, the Gender Equity Division. And when I asked him for some information about an unorthodox affiliation, he was a very mainstream kind of person, but he did reveal his interest in African American inventors, and he has given a number of presentations on that subject, which I think is very interesting. Mr. Reed is on the faculty of National University and the University of San Francisco. He teaches public administration, operations management, and public policy. James Reed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donna. I was very pleased to have Dr. Wright on the board on the panel this morning so that I wouldn't be the only technocrat speaking. As the project manager for the Energy Facility Siting Division of the California Energy Commission, I'm responsible for enforcing the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines in the application for certification of new power plants throughout the state. And when Jackie first asked me to speak, I naturally asked her, well, what does she want me to talk about? She asked me, well, talk about what you know. What have you been doing all these years of your professional life? And I've been in the electric industry, from nuclear to bringing the first wind farm online in Northern California and forcing the utility to sign the first contract with me to sell electricity to them. But to give you a brief history, the electric utilities in California actually began here in the Sacramento area with the first electrons began flowing from the Folsom Powerhouse down to Station A downtown here in Sacramento. That was prior to there even being controls and the knowledge that there were going to be natural monopolies developing in this state. Soon the Railroad Commission, the predecessor to the Public Utilities Commission, realized that there needed to be some control. They did not want California to become a Cleveland, Ohio, where 4 different utilities service users on the same block and you have a spaghetti of wires running in any direction. Now this continued along with the utilities being in charge of the generation of power, the transmission of power, and the distribution of power. The acronym GTD not only stands for generation, transmission, and distribution, but it also stands for get that dollar. Now, with the lightheartedness out of the way, prior to deregulation of the electric industry in the state of California, these utilities enjoyed their natural monopolies. They were controlled only by the Public Utilities Commission, who, as many of you understand, are appointees of various governors. Now, this all changed drastically back in 1996 with the advent of AB 1890, which was a deregulation of the electric utility industry. Now, if you'll notice that middle map over on my left and your right shows how the state is divided by the different utilities. Now, that came about from an economic perspective, in that many localities had their own power companies, and through mergers and acquisitions, the service territories of the various utilities began expanding. Pacific Gas and Electric bought utilities all the way down to the Tehachapis, because the Tehachapis are a natural barrier, and in through the Grapevine. Southern California Edison was buffered by that same natural boundary of getting up and over the mountains with their high voltage power lines. Well, along in the 1930s, the Rural Electrification Administration under President Roosevelt caused a number of these smaller utilities to be purchased first by the federal government and then subsequently purchased by private utilities. But coming back to deregulation, deregulation stated that if customers had a choice, if competitors were allowed to participate, then prices would go lower. Well, in theory, that's an excellent idea. But in reality, when supply is inadequate for demand, which when I wrote my master's thesis a couple years ago, I predicted that if more power plants don't get online, there's not going to be enough power to supply the demand. But under the authority of AB 1890, the power companies sold off all their power plants to private merchant generators. Now, when they sold it off to the private merchant generators, those merchant generators could sell their power to whoever bid the most. So our map lines began to blur. No longer were the investor-owned utilities responsible for generation, but they had to relinquish control of their transmission lines to a quasi-public state agency called the Independent System Operator that controls all the transmission lines. Now, many of those merchant plants found the map lines blurring even more so because of the growth in neighboring states such as Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, because these states' growth was exploding. Now, my mother would send a slapogram from Chicago if she heard me say that sentence in that particular way. My mother's a 6'1" retired school teacher, so I have to be careful sometimes. These merchant power generators are selling their power to the highest bidder, and oftentimes those highest bidders are outside of the state of California. And when they bid more for a megawatt of electricity than a marketer in California is willing to pay, that power is shipped out. So consequently, not only do we not have the supply available to meet the demand of the residents of the various territories in the state of California, that little supply we have is being sold out of state. Now, under the Western States Coordinating Council, all the states are supposed to coordinate their grid. Basically, all the generators put their electrons onto these wires, and wherever it needs to go, it's directed. Now, we used to get very cheap electricity from the Northwest through the California and Oregon transmission lines. However, Oregon is booming. People have left California and moved north. People have left California and moved to Washington and have gone to Nevada. Well, that power goes first to local agencies. So if we want to buy that power that's available, we then have to pay more. Now, recently in San Diego, the residents have experienced the effects of denying that there's a law of supply and demand in the electric industry in California. And because supply was low, demand was great, the price rose. Now, in the earlier session, I had seen one of my economics professors here, and he would have been amazed that I remembered this after that many years. However, the thing that we're now looking at in mapping the utilities of the state of California are where are these power plants to be sited? What are the impacts on the various communities? Are there environmental justice questions with a power plant being placed in the middle of a minority or low-income community? That power will not be delivered to that minority or low-income community. It may very well be sold to Phoenix, Arizona. It may be sold to Reno, Nevada. So we have to look very closely at the issues under the California Environmental Quality Act. Are we just going to have the pollution and not the benefit of the electrons being generated? Or are we going to have to put into place some actions so that those map lines are very distinct between the state of California, the state of Nevada, the state of Arizona, and the state of need of our populations? And with that, I'll close.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. I think you can see that we're moving away from nature and towards something else. And our final presenter is A.J. Block. Mr. Block is, or AG, I'm sorry, is the editor-in-chief of the California Journal. And when I asked him for information about an unorthodox affiliation, his response led me to believe that as a parent of a small child, unorthodoxy is very difficult. So he wasn't really able to give me any bit of information that I could use to blackmail him with later. Mr. Block.
Thank you. We're moving very much into the orthodox by talking about politics. And I'd like to preface my remarks by just asking the question, why are we talking about this? Why are we trying to draw artificial lines over what Dr. Beer said was a landscape that in humanists believe there are no lines across? And it's because we need to organize ourselves in some way to have some sort of government and to provide some kind of representation and some kind of forum where we can discuss the conflicts and problems that afflict everybody. I do, however, take some, I dispute the opening paragraph here, which says the spatial criteria for redrawing congressional and legislative districts tend to be highly unimaginative and staid regarding city lines. Well, okay, I brought some visual aids that you all will not be able to see very much of, but this is the current districts of the state of California. It's legislative. It's a booklet that we publish on its current legislative and congressional districts. And this statement that I just read definitely applies to this. It is sort of staid. It's unimaginative. It was drawn by Supreme Court masters because the legislature and the governor couldn't agree back in 1990 on what kind of a redistricting plan they wanted. This relic, and it is a relic, is the previous map book, which was drawn almost exclusively by the Democratic Party in California, with some interference by the courts, but not much. And some of these districts are highly imaginative. There is one, Congressional District 5, which was only contiguous at low tide in this, when San Francisco Bay was at low tide. That was a congressional district. These were all drawn, the congressional districts, by the late Phil Burton, a Democrat from San Francisco. That district was drawn for his brother, John, who is now the President Pro Tem of the Senate. It's a district that Nancy Pelosi now represents in some form. But that was a fairly imaginative district. There's another one, there's a Senate district in here, which encompassed both Mono Lake and the Pacific Ocean. That was a district that Democrats attempted to cram as many Republicans into one district as they possibly could. It was a district that was represented for 10 years by the late Ken Maddie. So sometimes the drawing of districts can be very, very imaginative, and I suspect that next year you will see an attempt once again to draw very imaginative political districts. Because the major political question in California is precisely what we're talking about here in some form, which is drawing new districts, drawing an artificial grid across the landscape of California to determine how communities will be lumped together in the legislature and the Congress. And because Democrats, of course, control the governor's office, and both houses of the legislature, and if there are any Republicans in the audience, I will tell you now that that dynamic will not change in November. The Democrats will control both houses of the legislature come November 9th or 8th, and so they will control the apparatus for doing it. I don't want to get into the technicalities, that's not really why I'm here, but it's not going to be the kind of process this time that it was in 1983 when Phil Burton retired to his study and essentially drew the maps because he knew all the census districts by heart. It won't happen that way. The technology, the ability of ordinary citizens and special interest groups to get their hands on the census information by precinct, by census tract, to have that information, put it on their computer, and buy programs that will, software programs that will draw these maps, anybody can do it now. And so the ability to really do mischief is greatly reduced by any one party. So the lines are not going to be as egregious as these, but they certainly will benefit Democrats and hurt Republicans. The question becomes, really, what are our political communities? And what kind of, the overall question that sort of popped into my mind when I was thinking about this panel is, and drawing lines, is what kind of representation do we want? Right now, we have representation that's based on geographic proximity. You live in the same town, you live in the same county. The Supreme Court masters went to great lengths to try and keep communities, towns, cities, counties in districts so that they're not split between various districts, if that's at all possible. But a political community is sort of different than that. It may be a geographic area, it may not. You can think about mutual interest, you can think about special interest. And I'll give you a quick and dirty list of political communities and then pose the question at the end. But farmers are a political community. Water users, farm workers are a separate political community. Lawyers are a political community. Land developers are a political community. Environmentalists, land preservationists are a political community. Commuters are a political community. Teachers, actors are a political community. College professors, that's a political community. And oil companies, oil workers, that's a political community. High-tech computer companies. The entertainment world is a growing community, political community in this state. Small business. You take the environmental movement, you take environmentalists, you can't lump them all together in the same pot. There are people who live on the coast who have different political interests than folks who live in the mountains. You have folks who live in the desert. You have skiers and hikers. You also have snowmobilers. You have resort owners. You have animal rights activists. You have those who want to do away with the Endangered Species Act. They're all political communities. They all have different interests. Ethnic groups are different interests among the various ethnic groups. And California now is a state without a majority ethnic group. Religious groups, all different kinds of religious groups. Each one is in of itself a political community. So my talk's really going to be the shortest of all, because I want to pose a question that perhaps we could all deal with. And in one, excuse me, in one form or another, we all have dealt with it. And that's what kind of representation is best for our society. Because when we draw lines, when we draw these artificial lines, we create the dynamic of government. That's what it does. That's what reapportionment does. And is society better off trying to solve its conflicts and its problems if it's organized according to a system of representation based on mutual interest or special interest rather than geographic proximity? And the law in California doesn't address that. It's pretty clear that when they sit down to draw lines, they're drawing these lines. They're drawing geographic lines, which means that every member of the legislature represents virtually every one of those special interests, rather than the anti-vivisectionists sending their own representative to Sacramento. Which is the better system? I think that's one of the things, one of the sort of the broader questions that this panel is attempting to get at. Is it the conventional way? Is it something else? So,
I'd like to try to answer that question.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Block. Please.
Back in 1991, I chaired the 1991 redistricting project here in Sacramento County, and we were able to force various jurisdictions to open the process to the public. And Mr. Block is correct. All you need is a powerful enough computer, and you can get the Tiger files from the U.S. Department of Census, download them, and begin drawing lines. Now, drawing the lines to address special interests or the general interests was what we had to look at when we drew the map lines for the city council districts of Sacramento. You had a historically disenfranchised, heavily minority community split between two upper middle class white communities so that they could never elect a representative of their choice, which is what our government is supposed to be based on. We reunited those areas. But along the same lines as Mr. Block's comments, I testified before the Supreme Court Masters on the drawing of the lines for the Assembly and Senate districts here in Sacramento County. They wanted to take South Sacramento with its heavily Democratic registration and attach it to the city of Stockton, which did not make sense to me that the individuals in South Sacramento would ever be able to elect a representative of their choice. And so we fought it, and we came out with some fairly, I still didn't like them, but maps that allowed the greatest degree of representation by the communities of general concern and additionally protected the interests of those groups that had been historically disenfranchised, the Hispanic and the African American and the Asian communities. And we were successful for the most part. What did it do after we drew the map? Money began flowing into South Sacramento. They currently have the largest city-owned building, except for the new EPA building, in the city of Sacramento. They were able to elect a representative of their choice, the late Sam Pinnell, and he did a lot for that community. But until map lines are drawn with citizen participation, and we have to get the lackadaisical nature of ourselves eradicated before we can even start addressing citizen participation. But if there isn't that citizen participation, we'll get the lines that the politicians want to protect their incumbency. And I tried to answer it as briefly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Reed.
Could I say
Please.
a word about it? I don't know how to say this briefly, but I'll try real hard. You know, again, having thought of myself and still thinking of myself as a radical, I keep coming down on the side of orthodoxy today. But perhaps I can say I'm arguing against the orthodoxy of medievalism, of corporatism. Basically, the notion of a corporate state, which was what was incorporated in pre-capitalist era, and is also a characteristic of fascist governments in the 20th century, and has been characteristic of many governments in Latin America, and I do most of my research in Latin America, so I'm familiar with this. Attempts, for a variety of reasons, to break down geographic identity and to build the notion of participation in the state through things like identity as who you are as a worker. You know, classically we had the estates in France. You were identified by status in society, and peasant, guild member, noble, etc. Or in Latin America, often now you're identified as peasant or rural worker or entrepreneurial, or you know, and you're actually formally represented in the state through your identity at least as much, if not more, than through your geographic location. I think that, one of the geniuses of liberal democracy was to reject that approach. I think that the fact that a representative in the California legislature must represent very diverse interests and opinions, as flawed as it is, and I think it's terribly flawed, is far superior to the notion of beginning to move more strongly towards representation by status. And as I say, there are thousands of volumes of political theory written on that. But in that respect, I would come down strongly on the side of classical liberal political theory that would hold that the identification by status, or even by what we would call interest group, in formal political representation is a great danger to democracy and to the state.
Thank you. Before we ask for questions or comments from the audience, I think one of my roles as moderator is to try to bring all of these exciting and very divergent presentations into some kind of alignment, and I am going to try to do that. I've been writing frantically here. I think that several themes have come out of our presentations, and perhaps one of them will be interesting enough for you to want to explore in a little more depth. Certainly a major subtext of our panel has been the whole idea of the definition of community and whose interests should rest at the center of any community definition. Mr. Block has raised the issue of special interest versus sort of common interest, and I think that's a powerful element of the idea of an unorthodox community, because those tend to be communities that are centered in special interest kinds of activities. We've also had some discussion here about the difference between sort of imaginative mapping and practical mapping, and that idea might be one that we'd like to explore in a little more depth. And finally, I've heard a theme that involves the idea of the community as either non-nature or almost anti-nature, that the human community has to make some definition of itself in relationship to the geography and natural landscape and the resources associated with that landscape. One of the elements that Mr. Reed did not go into quite such a detail in his presentation, but that was part of a conversation I had with him, was that the history of the electric utilities in California has essentially been a sort of geographic community history, that for a very long time, small communities were interested in developing their own electric power, and the small electric company was a small community's resource and not a national or grid-centered activity. And I thought that was a very interesting element of this idea of mapping the community. So our final question to you, and one we hope, in addition to your own questions, that you might want to address, is the idea of which sorts of needs and desires should be foregrounded in any mapping of a community. And now I'm going to turn it to you, and we'd be happy to hear comments or questions. Please, yes, sir.
Yes, this is for Angus Wright, but anyone else who wishes to comment may do so. I kind of gleaned from your comments that maybe you think that proportional representation is not a good idea. It is practiced in various forms in most European countries. Would you just care to comment, and anyone else who wants to do so?
I don't know. You may have to explain to me why you drew that conclusion from my talk.
Because the various parties may represent different types of interest groups, and there's a connection there.
In my later comment, on the second comment, yeah. And to that degree, to the extent that parties to some extent represent interest or status-bound groups, right? Then, and of course, I don't know. I kind of go back and forth on the notion of proportional representation and what I think of it. What I do think of it, one thing I could say for sure is that I don't think, all proportional representation systems have to decide to what degree they weight the proportional representation that is not representative of districts, right? There are all sorts of different ways of going at it that different governments have worked out in terms of weighting geographical, or as was put here, common interest type representations versus narrower party representations of minority parties. And I guess what I would say is I'm not firmly against proportional representation, but that my bias would be to keep it as a relatively minor element at best, right? If I can, if that makes sense to you. That it'd be fine to have it as a way that some minority interests could be represented that otherwise would not, but not in a way that would essentially reorganize the state along those, or reorganize all representation along those lines.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the communities, because most people see themselves in several communities. You even mentioned that. And it's perhaps human nature to like, it benefits to be very individual. So when I'm discussing the siting of a utility, I'm in a very narrow little community. When I'm talking about getting electrical services, though, I'm part of the state of California. And it's the same way you mentioned before when I'm part of a suburban community. The life of the suburban community is my little community, but I'm part of a large transit district. And I'm wondering how to put the communities together, however you draw them, so that the costs and the benefits are somehow at least contiguous, maybe not geographically, but as far as interest.
Do you have a suggestion?
No.
I'm interested.
More interested in hearing certainly what.
To just follow up on that, I was very interested in Mr. Block's visual aids, in which, in all of the district drawing that he showed us, the analogy or metaphor, the visual metaphor, was the jigsaw puzzle. And so that idea that the parts are going to make a coherent whole, and somehow be different, but also fit together, seems to me to be so dialectical as to be impossible to be particularly useful. And so you're suggesting the very thing I was wondering about. What would be a better metaphor, visual metaphor even, for what it is we would be trying to do? And I unfortunately thought of the linen closet. Sort of stacks of things that get moved around depending on how you need them.
Well, Dr. Ray did mention metropolitan regional governments, and I thought you were proposing that as a possible solution, and I was wondering how that would
As an element of a solution, yeah. You know, as if we were going to make a first step, should we make a step towards, you know, watershed, floristic provinces, or should we make a step towards metropolitan regional government? To me, the metropolitan regional government would be far better first step, and one which we have not pursued in any great degree in California. You know, originally I was going to link the Edward Abbey comment a little closer to the talk, in the sense that, you know, I think there might be the ability to, over a long period of time, over decades or a century, to make our districts more conform to natural boundaries, but that an attempt to do that now would ignore the major problems we face now, right? And that, to me, you know, again, you know, I don't want to oversimplify, but that's what you have to do in this sort of forum, you know. You know, to me, the great problem is the ability of and the attractiveness to people of suburban flight, and what makes that attractive, and why that is occurring, and the dynamics of that is what we really have to get in hand, and we have to control the dynamics of land speculation. We have to control the dynamics of taxation, a whole variety of public policy issues that end up favoring this kind of growth that seems to me the most disastrous thing that we face, and that therefore mechanisms, to the degree that metropolitan regional government or other mechanisms can be designed to tackle that, is in my mind the first priority.
I want to just ask sort of generically, what is a regional government anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Natural boundaries used to work. They don't anymore.
Right.
Best evidence of that is the Altamont Pass.
Right.
Everything to the west of the Altamont Pass was a community, right? Down in the Silicon Valley, Livermore, Pleasanton, that area. And Tracy, Lodi, Stockton, that was separate. Well, they're not separate anymore. Mm-hmm. You got a city over on the west side of that sue the city of Tracy not long ago because Tracy had approved a development to bring more housing into that area. It impacted, you may know, it was Livermore or one of those cities on the other side, Pleasanton, because all the traffic was going to go through that city to the west to get from the workplace in San Jose to the living space in the Central Valley. So that community has blended. I think I heard Mr. Reed say that his mother lived in Chicago. That's also my old stomping grounds. And it used to be that when somebody said that Chicago and Milwaukee were going to be one city, when I grew up in the 50s, you would laugh at that. Now, You don't laugh at that. They're growing together. So the whole notion of trying to, again, draw a line around what you think is a community may not, even in geographic terms, be a community in a decade. It may be something much, much broader than that.
But everyone on this panel has, I think, had resonating the idea that people, as people, like the idea of something that's a scale that they find comfortable and accessible, and that some of our difficulty comes from when we start out saying, I'm just not nature, my community is that part that's sort of improving nature,
Well,
but suddenly we're talking about a much larger.
Well, one of the problems in California, and many people ascribe to this who actually pay attention to state government, is that state government's far too small. The legislature is far too small. The New Hampshire legislature, I think, the lower house is 435 members of the lower house of the New Hampshire legislature, which, so they represent,
right.
9 people in their neighborhood. But think about that for a minute. That's something that the ordinary citizen can get her hands around. In California, a Senate district represents 800,000 people. Thank you. 800,000 people. There are 4 or 5 members of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. 5 members of the Board of Supervisors in Los Angeles County. Think how big that constituency is. So when you talk about shrinking the size of government, you talk about creating the kind of government that is responsive to people. Can a state senator be responsive to 800,000 people? Maybe not. Again, it's another layer of complexity that over this whole idea of what is a community and how do you fashion this a representative kind of government.
Yes, please.
But survey after survey and study after study shows that the voters and the populace as a whole wants less government. They want fewer representatives. They want, we've seen bills, as a Los Angeles County resident, we've seen bills before, or propositions before fail that would expand the size of the supervisor's board. I mean, but at the same time, people want better representation. They want better services. And they
Something of a dilemma, isn't it?
That's the voters want it. But so what do you do in that case? When people want smaller government that's less intrusive, and yet they want better representation.
Well, the cynical answer is that the public gets the government it asks for and deserves. But that's not our function. I mean, our function is to at least come up with ideas about what might work better. But you also, let me just add one other thing, is that you also see all kinds of, in Los Angeles specifically, you see all kinds of secession movements. The San Fernando Valley wants to break away. They want to splinter the Los Angeles Unified School District. There is at least underpinnings of discontent with the kind of monolithic government that Los Angeles County has.
Mr. Reed.
But you have to be able to separate the bureaucracy from the elected representatives. When you lump them together, people say we want smaller government. They're not saying they want smaller representation. They're saying they want more representation. They want to flatten out or have a more horizontal governmental entity. So what you said is not quite accurate, because people want to not have to go through 8 to 10 bureaucrats to get to their elected representative. However, if there are more elected representatives, instead of a state senator having 800,000, maybe a more workable number is 100,000. That young lady.
The young lady in brown, please.
I thought it was kind of interesting what you were saying about the concept of folks paying for the urban areas. I'm sure that'll play real well outside these halls as far as taxes and things like that go. Although I think it's an interesting concept. I just don't have a whole lot of faith in voters wanting to be taxed any more than they are. And the other concept about urban flight, Isn't it in some areas going backwards now? Because in Washington, D.C., where I just moved from, people were actually moving back into the city because the transportation systems were failing so badly. And so I think it's interesting that your concept is to look more at systems like metropolitan areas where we're dividing things up maybe by transportation or water districts or whatever, different types of districts. I'm almost inclined to think that we need to go back to the kind of districts where you're looking at people rather than systems, because I think if you try to divide, I think representation means representation in the classic, I'm a community, like you're saying, in your heart, rather than looking at these systems and where we need to move all the pieces parts. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but that's kind of my perspective on it.
Did you want a response
Yeah.
from me or else? Okay. Let me take your first point, of the unattractiveness of what I'm proposing. I'm painfully aware of that, but, I think that our obligation as citizens just very simply is to say what we think. And, I believe that we, to some extent, have been disenfranchised by a kind of media and image approach to government in which something which begins to be said to be unpopular can no longer be said. Because, well, don't say that, because that's a losing cause, and losers talk about losing causes, and you don't want to be identified as a loser. That whole kind of dynamic. And so, I think that, as with the question that we were dealing with over here, with respect to the number of representatives and the unpopularity of the issue in Los Angeles and so forth, about big government, you have to keep saying what you think is correct from your perspective, from your point of view, and from your experience.